Good morning, and thank you for joining us. I'm Debbie Vini. I am the Senior Vice President of Communications and Marketing at the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools, and we are thrilled to release our new report, Voting with Their Feet, which is a state-level analysis of charter school enrollment. I see that there are a number of participants that are still entering the room, so I'm going to give just another moment or two before we get started, and I'll be introducing the other great members of the panel who are here with me today. For people who are just joining us, thank you so much. We're just giving a moment. I see that there are a lot of participants that are coming in as I speak. So we're just going to give it another moment, and then we'll get started.
Can you confirm the address for me, please?
All right, great. So we're going to kick off now. Good morning. I am Debbie Vini, and I am the Senior Vice President of Communications and Marketing at the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools. And I am joined here by the co-author, my co-author of this report, Drew Jacobs. And we are releasing today the report, Voting with Their Feet. And we also have joining us today, Ms. Naomi Shelton, who's the Naomi N. Shelton, I should tell you, her middle initial is N, in case you want to look for her on the social medias. She is the CEO of the National Charter Collaborative, and we also have with us Jasmine Morrison, who is a parent advocate, and we're delighted to have her join us today. So voting with their feet. So let's talk a little bit about how we got started with this. I was looking at some news coverage coming in beginning probably like late last fall into the winter, which was showing some interesting patterns, maybe at that point, probably not even a pattern, interesting incidents of charter school enrollment that spiked in certain places. And then I was also seeing stories about district school enrollment being at record lows in a number of states and in a number of cities. So I got curious, as I often do, and I went over to my friend Drew and by Zoom and said, hey, what do you think about looking at this and seeing if there's something more to it? Is this just an anomaly that's happening in one or two places, or is this something bigger? Does it speak to a larger trend that's happening across the country? And it's big. It actually is happening in a lot of places, and it is a pretty significant trend in terms of enrollment shifting year over year. So we looked at the first full school year of the pandemic, which is the year 2020 through 2021, and we compared that to the prior year. And what we were looking at was total numbers of students that were enrolled in public schools. And then we split them out and said, of the different types of public schools, both charter and district, where did we see any movement happening? And what we saw was there was a pretty significant jump, about almost 250,000 kids who moved into charter schools. These were new students that enrolled for the first time in charter schools. And the total number is actually somewhere around 237,000, so just shy of 240. And we saw that when we looked into what was happening in the different states, it was all different types of communities. So this was rural, it was urban, it was suburban. Some of it certainly was due to virtual charters. That's a natural question that we had too. We were saying, well, maybe because it was a pandemic year and a lot of instruction was happening online, was this like to full-time virtual charters? And a little bit, but not nearly as much as one might have suspected or worried about. So we saw that really only in 3 states, Oklahoma, Pennsylvania, and Utah, was a significant amount of the charter school enrollment growth directly attributed to full-time charters. So we have state data from 42 states. Drew's going to talk to you about why we have 42 states as opposed to the full potential data set of 46 states. And the short answer, spoiler alert, is that it was hard to get the 42 states because this was some off-cycle reporting. But we, from those states, were able to see a 7% year-over-year increase in charter school enrollment, which compares to just slightly over a 3%, about 3.3% decrease in district school enrollment during the same period of time. And this was not at all a one-to-one swap. So we're talking about 1.4 million students that exited their district schools. And as I said, about 240,000 of them who were new students at charter schools. So why did they choose charters? Why did they leave their district schools? It's a little bit early to be able to say that, and this report does not get into it. We can ponder. We have some maybe hypotheses on why that might have happened, and that's exactly why we have both Jasmine and Naomi here with us today, because they're going to talk us through some of the things that they have seen, both amongst charter leaders and then within their respective communities as well. So we're not exactly sure why what happened, but the numbers are clear and compelling. It happened, and it happened in a lot of places. It happened in red states. It happened in blue states. It happened in places with mature charter sectors. It happened in places with emerging or newer charter sectors. It happened in the Deep South. It happened in the Northeast. It happened on the West Coast. It happened on the East Coast. And there really isn't any pattern except to say that it was everywhere. That was the pattern for the most part. We did see in some places where capacity in terms of the actual number of seats, where there wasn't a lot, like in the District of Columbia, there's a wait to get into a charter school, as most of you know. There wasn't a lot of room to grow because there literally were not seats. And so it looked pretty flat year over year in the District of Columbia. We saw the same thing in Louisiana. But where there was capacity, parents maximized that. And just to contextualize it, by the time all the numbers are in, we expect that the year-over-year growth for that full year of the pandemic will look like more than doubling of what we had seen in the prior year. That is significant. While charter schools have consistently maintained their enrollment numbers in the positive direction, we've always grown every year since there have been charter schools, the rate of that growth had certainly slowed a bit over the past 5 years, and this is a reversal of that trend. It is a significant spike and certainly worth discussing. And from what we've seen from polling data in several states, I will mention both our California Charter Schools Association and also the Georgia Association did polling of registered voters and sometimes of parents, and they want more. It is clear that the only thing stopping more growth is more seats. And it is important that we listen to what parents are telling us and we pay close attention to what they did, because it is only parents that could have done this. There was no mandate. There was no big advertising campaign that happened that told people what they needed to do. People looked to find better options because they wanted something different in a public school option for their children. And when they found it, they liked it. So we are really, really encouraged to see this amount of interest in charter schools and believe that it is the start of a trend that will go on for some time. I'm going to invite my co-author, Drew, to talk to us a little bit about the methods behind this report and how we collected the data.
Thank you so much, Debbie. Good morning, everybody. It's so wonderful to be with you all today. As Debbie mentioned, I'm Drew Jacobs. I'm the Senior Director for Policy Research and Evaluation at the National Alliance. So let me talk a little bit about the data sources as well as the methodology and how we calculated the numbers. So to begin, as Debbie mentioned, the data in this report covers 42 out of 46 states where there is charter enrollment. There were 4 states and territories where we were unable to get data, and those states and territories are Guam, Puerto Rico, Kansas, and Tennessee. For different reasons. Guam and Puerto Rico, we just simply had a hard time hearing back from them. Kansas has redacted data, so that was a challenge. And Tennessee tends to be a late publisher of data, so the data was not available yet for 2020, 2021 in Tennessee. But for the other 42 states, we have data. One of the things that is unique about this report is that the data comes directly from state education agencies. And not to get too far into the weeds, but a lot of the data that we source at the National Alliance, if you're familiar with our data dashboard, which is at data.publiccharters.org, that data comes through federal sources, through the United States Department of Education. But given the timeliness of this topic, we sourced our information for this report from state education agencies. It's important to know, kind of along those lines, that not all states collect or present enrollment information or enrollment data in the same way. And in fact, they basically all present it in different ways. So that's actually one of the reasons why, as an organization, we work with a lot of federal data, is because it's a little bit smoother, it's a little bit more uniform, whereas state data tends to be a little bit more disparate, and states have different ways that they collect and report their data. So that's just an important thing to know. So as such, the level of granularity of the data that we have for states varies. So for some states, we simply have statewide enrollment data for charter schools and for all other public schools. In some places, we have more granular data. We have data all the way down to the school level, where we can see school level enrollment trends for charters and for district schools. In terms of the sources, so all of our information comes from state education agencies, but some of the sources vary as well. So some of the sources are big Excel data files that some of you who work with this information on a regular basis might be familiar with. Some of the sources are charter school annual reports, which are required in a lot of states. Some are legislative reports. Some are fact sheets on charter schools and district schools. The unifying factor for this report, and something that I think is a true strength of the report, is in every single instance for every single state that we have in this report, we've identified very clearly where the information was sourced from, so people can go and see for themselves. So you all will be able to take a look at the report and see that data for yourself should you be interested. In terms of the methodology and how we calculated the figures in the report, there are basically two major ways that we performed the calculation. In some states, there's just a very clear breakout of the data that's presented. Like, you go on the website for the state of California, for example, and you're able to see a table that says charter school enrollment, non-charter school enrollment, and it's right there, it's clear as day. And so in those instances, we just accepted those figures, and we've noted that in our report. In other places, it was a little bit more complex. We had to walk through a process where we first identified, okay, which schools in the state are charter schools, and then we total up the enrollment for those charter schools, and then we deduct that charter enrollment from statewide total public enrollment to get to the non-charter figure. It was important to us to kind of employ two principles in these calculations. Number one, we wanted to have very clear sources, which we definitely do, and you can see them in the report. And two, we wanted to have very uncomplicated calculations. My little joke that I share, my anecdote, is you could get 10 people in a room who are familiar with this work and ask them to calculate enrollment figures for a state, and you might get 4 or 5 different answers. So we've presented really clear calculations in this report. We feel really good about them, and we're really excited about it. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions, and I'll pass it back over to Debbie.
Thank you so much, Drew. I would love to ask the ladies who've joined us today to kind of jump into this discussion a little bit before we go to Q&As. And I see there's some very good Q&As in the chat, and we are definitely going to be able to respond to those. But why don't we start with you, Jasmine? So you're a parent advocate, and I'm wondering, as you're hearing the numbers that we were talking about and the data trends that we saw, what do you think about that? What do you think about what we saw? Does that mirror what you saw in your community?
Yeah, it definitely does. And I think that, during this time period, you know, it was a lot of tragedy and a lot of loss, but there was also opportunities for parents to get a lens into their children's education that they didn't have before. And then came the period where we could implement those changes. So, you know, as a parent, you got to see what the curriculum was like. You got to see teaching methods. You got to see resources that were available to children. And then you also got a very close look at your children as a student, and then got to see their level of enthusiasm. And you started to say to yourself, what is going to be the best place that's going to cultivate my child's character as well as their academic performance, and lastly, that's going to form as a community around me that's going to enable me to help them. And so once parents got that close look, a lot of us started to vote with our feet and make the decisions to move our children to places that were going to do that.
Thank you, Jasmine. Naomi, you have a really interesting seat here because of the work that you do directly with charter leaders of color. And so I'm wondering about whether what we saw mirrors what you saw or heard from charter leaders of color that your organization supports.
Awesome. So just to give a little more context, the National Charter Collaborative is a nonprofit focused on supporting leaders of color who founded or lead single site charter schools. So we know about the big box networks, but for those mom and pops, as I like to refer to them as, we want to make sure they're receiving the support that's necessary for them to support the communities that they serve. We have heard research that speaks to why having Black teachers is important, but if you were to look at data over time and to see when a school leader, the person who sets the culture, sets the climate, and sets the conditions for the academic excellence of the school, that means that they're going to show up differently for the students who look like them or are in similar circumstances that they have experienced themselves. One of the things that we noticed over time, and I have worn different hats in the charter community, and having the nimbleness, the ability to be flexible during very unprecedented times. People were comfortable with the idea of having the ability to make the decision for what was best for their children. So as Jasmine spoke to, being able to see for firsthand what was happening, how their children were being treated in the classroom was an important enlightening moment for parents. But we also know that there was a racial reckoning happening in the midst of this pandemic. And the amount of conversation that has exploded over the last few months. The very early days of the pandemic meant that people were being exposed and seeing what the actual climates were for their children's education environment. And they wanted to make sure that they were being served fully and completely. So one of the things that we noticed just anecdotally is that parents appreciated the flexibility, like I said, the nimbleness of their schools, for the charter schools to be able to function and make decisions very quickly versus having to wait for a district to make those determinations. And in hearing those stories, because we all know that parents may vote with their feet, but they also ask other parents questions, and being able to hear or see what was happening at one school or the other, because now I need to know, what are you getting? What am I getting? And making that comparison, they were able to determine very, very quickly, oh, I like these circumstances at this school more than I like what's happening in my child's district school. And so while, in places like DC, where we have a lottery, and open enrollment, it's easier. It's actually more difficult to do that transition. But because things continue to change so rapidly, we were able to see schools whose parents asked for them to increase their grade range. We've seen all types of things shift very, very quickly, and leaders be able to meet those needs. And that nimbleness, I think, speaks to how Black and Brown communities show up for one another all the time. And the leaders that we support being able to know how they have to meet the needs of their communities, of their parents and families, again, because of their own experiences, speaks to a different understanding of what it is that this entire charter sector is about. It's about being able to have the autonomy to make decisions for the community that you serve.
Thank you for that, Naomi. Jasmine, I want to follow up on something that Naomi said and ask you if you might talk about your personal experience. What is it that you saw within your specific community? I know people came to you and asked you um, what they should do. People were dissatisfied with what they were experiencing. So I wonder if you could go into a little bit more detail and color about that and tell us what you saw, what you heard, how you advise people, and why you think people thought that moving to charter schools was a better choice for them.
Yeah, so during the pandemic, when they had gotten that first glimpse, because we had that first round where we were home all unexpectedly, and then enrollment time came and people knew that they definitely wanted to make a decision to change. We had to then determine like what was the best change for them. And we started talking about, to Naomi's point, the nimbleness that each charter school was able to offer. So parents got to make a decision, not just on location, but what is actually going to be the best environment for my child. And so we looked at schools in terms of school culture. We looked at academics, of course, but in some cases, it was really more about the level of fit for the child. And because there was already a level of academic standard that was set. And so that gave most parents a nice kind of bouncing off to say, okay, great. Now I could think about my child's development as a child and what do I think would be the best school to develop them. So we as a parent network, and I think Naomi pointed that out, like it kind of starts to go parent to parent to parent to parent and talk about, okay, well, I know your child and they seem to like art. So there's a charter school that has arts, and your child, one parent that I helped had a child that was very interested in mathematics and science, but then another child that really had some special needs that they wanted to kind of make sure were going to be addressed. And they were able to find, again, very academically sound charter schools, although not the same charter schools, to accommodate their child. And so it speaks to the fact that showing up in our communities to develop our children and not to focus on so much the system of developing the system, we can make great strides there. We can actually develop children that are academically sound and emotionally developed and enhanced. And I want to just say, kudos to a few schools that really stood out in that area, because while on, these Zoom meetings, it wasn't turn your head around. It wasn't, where are you? It was good job. You're amazing. And that was just, as a parent, to see your kid, do a little happy dance because they got a certificate on Zoom, by the way. I mean, most of us are like an hour of meetings and we're like, I'm done. It just really spoke to the fact that they were prepared, they were flexible, and they were willing to give it their all. And as parents, we really appreciated that and recognized that by, again, voting with our feet and flooding those schools.
Oops, I'm muted. Sorry about that. Thank you so much. I'm going to shift a little bit and take some of the questions that we have. I've got more things that I want to ask each of you as well, but I want to make sure that we're responding to some of the questions that we've got here from our participants. So I'm going to take this one from Crystal McQueen Taylor, who is asking, does the 1.4 million students who left district schools include students who have graduated or aged out? Or does that number only include currently eligible and enrolled K-12 students? So I am going to pass that over to our researcher, Drew.
Great question, Crystal. Simply put, it's currently eligible students. So we looked at enrollment files from states for 2019-20, and then we looked at a separate set of enrollment files for 2020-2021. And all of those files are available. Like you can look at the report and you'll see exactly where we pulled that information from.
Awesome, thank you, Drew. So I'm gonna take another question here from Amy. And Amy's question is, were there any patterns of certain types of charter schools that were receiving more of the nearly 240. Drew would kick me under the table if we were in the same rooms. And I'm supposed to say nearly 250, nearly 240,000 students who moved. Were they mostly CMOs versus smaller sites? Or any patterns based on instructional models such as Montessori, language immersion, traditional, classic, college prep?
You want me to take that one, Debbie?
I'll let you take that
Okay,
one.
yes. So the answer to this is that it was really challenging to pick up on those trends. And Amy, I think, is the one who had the question. Amy, we were curious about that as well. And, you know, it's a challenge and a limitation of the data, right? Like in some places we have only statewide data, and not to geek out, I know, like, you know, the data is not always everybody's jam, but it's complicated. It's really complex. Even just ascertaining like which schools are charter schools in a given state when you look at these data files is challenging. So the answer on like model type and like pedagogical, so it's like CMO, EMO, and then also pedagogical model is we don't have a ton of information on that. And what we do have in some places is some information about subpopulations. So in some places we have like the ability to look at grades. In some places we have the ability to look at race and ethnicity and see like how did trends change and shift for those, for, you know, for particular groups of students. And you'll notice that in the report that we highlight California and Arizona with some breakouts that look at subpopulations. So in some places, yes, and in some places, no.
Thank you, Drew. Now we've got another question coming in from Fawn Campbell. And this one is about how do we find out about charter schools that are being considered in communities? So there's not a clear cut answer to that one, but there are a few of us on here who can maybe try to help you think that through. So Naomi, I'm gonna pass that to you because you're closest to people that are single site operators and, you know, so often new school operators. And then Naomi's other hat, she knows quite a bit about that process.
Right. So, and thankfully I've been able to put that hat up in a way and it's tucked in a hat box. So there are two different ways. So I'll start from my role as a former authorizer here in the district. One of the ways that you can find out, there is an application process in your jurisdiction, in your region, in your locality. And that application process varies from state to state. You are able to hear and see and read, in most cases, what those applications look like. So I'll speak to DC's application process because that's what I'm most familiar with. Basically, a charter school comes up with the founding team. They write a charter, which is why they are called charter schools. They write an application to say what it is that they want to be able to do. Right. So I'm sure some of you know this, but people are able to review that charter application to see what the tone, tenor, what the culture, climate, what all of the academic makeup, what the team will look like based on that application. It's also possible for you to either, if there's a state-based alliance or the authorizing bodies will have information for the schools whose charters they have approved. So the best ways is to check those two places to see, you know, who's been approved and who's operating, but also who is looking to start a school. That application process here in DC is an open process. It is explored during the public meetings of the DC Public Charter School Board. And during those meetings, everything from all the questions that members of the board have about the application, which those applications can vary from 150 to 300 pages long, being able to ask questions about those applications to see what are the conditions that they are creating for their students, their families, but also their staff, and what professional development they will have, what type of extracurricular activities, etc. And that process, again, varies from place to place, but that is probably the best way for you to get familiar with schools that are interested in opening. In terms of newer schools, again, the authorizers or the authorizing bodies would have information about the schools that have been recently opened. We at the National Charter Collaborative are, we're basically a network of understanding and getting to know the different, again, the state or local areas that have either an existing consortium or coalition of existing schools that are bringing new people into the fold, and making sure that we're keeping tabs of how that's happening. We either find out from incubators or other organizations whose applications are out there that are, of course, single site, and being made aware of what's happening with other leaders of color that are going possibly into larger networks. But to have a clear picture of who opened up during COVID, there were several schools that actually opened in this region, in the DC area region during the pandemic. And it's one thing to open a school by yourself without a larger either school district helping you or a large network helping you, but to be able to open a school during a pandemic is a different level of fortitude. I hope that answered a portion of your question.
Thank you, Naomi. That was a very thorough response. We have another question here from Wendy Tucker about the disaggregation of data. So Drew, this one is going to be for you. Were we able to disaggregate the data at all to look at trends for categories of students, like students with disabilities, EL students, et cetera?
Yes, so it's similar to my response earlier, and Wendy, thank you for the question. There are some places where that, some states where that data is available. One that comes to mind is California. There's some very robust data that is you could access for California. And I'm happy to, Wendy, if we can always talk offline too, and I can give you more of a sense there, but it's mixed again, because the level of granularity that exists in the data, it's mixed across states.
Now, Wendy, Wendy has a follow-on question, which I suspect we're not able to answer with the data set that we have, but I'm going to push that one to you as well, Drew. So this is about looking at the regression of this trend in the upcoming or the current school year. So 2021 to 2022. Specifically, her question is about North Carolina. And in North Carolina, district public schools were allowed to open a virtual option, but charter schools were not allowed to until recently. And her question is, do we think that the charter numbers are being negatively impacted? And what are we seeing there?
Sure thing. Yeah, I can take a crack at that. So two things I would say. Number one is we will be tracking the 2021-2022 enrollment patterns. We'll continue to follow this topic. It is a little early to kind of comment on that, though some states are coming out with that data. A lot of states, also, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, the way that states collect enrollment data varies, but many states employ an October 1 count. So that's happening very shortly, right? So that data will start to come in for 2021, 2022. The second thing I would say is policies obviously vary state to state in terms of what's permitted. You referenced a specific policy for North Carolina, and I would say that those policies are just as diverse as the number of states we have. So long-winded way to say is, like, we're going to continue to track this topic through 2021, 2022 to see how the trends continue to shape up.
Thank you, Drew. I see that Jamie Simmons has asked my personal favorite question, which is when are we going to see some enrollment data from Tennessee? So we really wanted enrollment data from Tennessee, to so much so that we actually delayed the timing of the report to try and give it more time to see if we could get that data from Tennessee. Drew will have more information about like the specific timing of what's available and when. So why don't I kick that one over to you as well?
Thanks, Debbie. Thank you, Jamie, for the question and all of your good work in Tennessee. Tennessee, just as just anecdotal point, it tends to be a state that releases its enrollment data a little bit late. So in my experience, I've seen Tennessee release its enrollment data in October or November, but obviously there's not at this time a kind of a formal date that we're aware of, but we really look forward to updating the report based upon that information. What I can tell you is we took just kind of a quick look at Tennessee data, and we saw that between 2018-19, Tennessee enrolled approximately 40,000 students in charters. 19-20, they enrolled about 43,000 students in charter schools. So we obviously can't say anything about Tennessee in the pandemic for 2020, 2021, but what we do know about Tennessee is we've seen a lot of charter growth in that state over the past several years. So we'll definitely be looking out for that data and keeping track of that.
Thank you. I'm going to take another question. By the way, thank you guys. You were such an awesome and engaging audience. I love all the back and forth. So this is great. Thank you for the terrific questions. I'm going to take another question that comes from a friend in California. Guys, I'm so sorry. There's something funky happening with my throat right now. But Jennifer Ritter Cook is wondering if we could do a little bit of talking about what we saw in California specifics. Now, Drew, we actually did do some deep dive into California because you saw some interesting trends, and that was one of the places where we were able to do some degree of disaggregation of data. So wonder if you might be able to talk a little bit about more of what we saw there, and then I'll be happy to layer on top of that anecdotally some of the things that we've seen working with the state organization.
Sure thing, and thank you for the question on California. I'll just note at the top that there's a great table in the report regarding California that looks specifically at subpopulations, racial and ethnic groups in California. And what we saw, just the overall headline is basically for every group, we saw an increase in the number of students from those groups that were enrolling in charter schools, and a decrease in the number of students from those groups who are enrolling in other public schools within California. The groups that in California specifically where we saw kind of big booms, Filipino population, white students, sorry, I'm looking over here because I've got the data handy, Asian students, and several other groups as well. So there's definitely more available in the report on that topic. And just to plug, since I'm a data geek, California actually has some pretty decent and very accessible data that, like, if you go to our report in the end notes, I know nobody reads the end notes, I read the end notes, but if you click on the link, it'll take you to California's data quest, and there's just some really great quick hit, easy things that you're able to pull. So take a look for sure.
Thank you for that, Drew. I'll layer on that and say, given the all-out war that has been waged against charter schools in California, they have fared incredibly well and certainly dodged a bullet in the last legislative cycle with a really harmful bill, although I hear it's coming back. So they keep up the good fight, but despite the opponents that have really been coming hard for California, people like charter schools. And they are hungry for more. And I think it bodes well for all of us to listen to what parents are showing us, because they can show us better than they can tell us, right? With what they're choosing to do with their kids. We have another question, Naomi. I'm going to kick this one over to you, which is specifically about how locations for charter schools are selected.
Sure. Well, I always like to preface all of the questions when people have the blanket idea of charter schools. We know that school districts, we know that private schools, we know that virtual schools, we know that all of these different types of schools look different in different, not just states, neighborhoods, right? So let's be very clear that there is not one universal way that charter school, anything happens across the country. So the location selection and facilities issue looks different in it looks different everywhere. In some places, schools co-locate. In some places, schools can build their own buildings. So it looks different in different parts of the country. And so again, the broad stroke idea of what happens with charter schools in one jurisdiction versus the other just is not accurate. Just as traditional school districts vary depending on where you are in a state. There are some commonalities, but when it comes to facilities and location, that looks different in different places.
Thank you for that. Jasmine, I'm gonna get you into this conversation as well. So we've got a question, another question that came in from Amy, which was about basically was there some correlation between schools that were unionized or not unionized, and whether parents made choices about that? So I'm going to put a little bit more on this, Amy, than what you had in your note. And if I've gotten that wrong, please respond back to me in the chat. But we know in some places, because of collective bargaining arrangements, it was not possible to do a certain amount of instruction, let's say, per week, or because of collective bargaining arrangements in some places, there maybe virtual learning was not available at all. And so I'm going to ask you, thinking about it from that lens, in being who you are, being a parent advocate and a resource that many parents turn to in the community, did you hear the things like that? What was happening in your specific community?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question, because parents don't know off the bat which schools are unionized and which schools are not, but they can tell there's a difference. I happen to know, because of my advocacy role, which schools are unionized and which schools are not. So when they're veering towards one school versus the other, it does tend to be the ununionized school. They find that there's more resource time available. There's more contact with the teachers. There are different supports, rather it's after school tutoring services that are just readily available, but they haven't yet really been able to put their finger on why it is available. I also wanted to just go back slightly to the whole us voting with our feet. And I wanted to just make sure that I highlighted that this was not an easy task for parents to transfer a child from one school to another. And so in no way do I think we're taking it for granted, but when we see these numbers rising, it says a lot, especially when you're a parent of multiple children who may have been in various schools. You have to get documentation for each one of those children, transfer documents, birth certificates, proof of residency, and the list goes on, report cards. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. And you have to upload them or deliver them individually for each child. And so in the middle of a pandemic where you can't get into the prior school because they're virtual and therefore administration services are limited, or you can't get to the doctor's office because you have more than one child and they're only letting one child in at a time for you to get health records. And you must now, you may not have the birth certificate readily available, or you had it and you moved yourself, or you're staying with family because of the pandemic situation, you need a copy of that. So for parents to do all of this legwork to make these decisions means that they are showing a lot of trust in charter schools and a lot of expectations for all that their children will become in the hands of these schools. So I just wanted to just take that moment to acknowledge that, because it's no easy task to transfer a child.
Thank you for that. And that, I think that's a really important insight. My child is old, so a number of us who do this work are not as close to it as you are, which is why it's so important to have you here. And we're thrilled to have your particular perspective as a parent, but you're absolutely right. This was not as simple as just deciding like, I'm going to switch my cell phone carrier. There's a lot to it. And that many people were willing to persevere and be persistent to do this certainly signals that it meant a lot to them. We are about 15 minutes before we're going to close, so I'm going to try to get to as many questions as I can. I'm going to hop around a little bit. I want to make sure that we answer a question that came in specifically about virtual charters. So this comes from Tari Reineck. I hope I got your name pronounced correctly. And during my opening remarks, I mentioned that we did see some growth that was directly attributed to full-time virtual charter schools. And those were in Oklahoma, Pennsylvania, and Utah specifically. Oklahoma saw tremendous year-over-year growth, the largest of any state. And we know that it was largely due to virtuals. That was a 78% year-over-year growth. Now, with that said, it's important to note that the number 2 state, in terms of the raw number of students that were new enrollees. And it's important to talk about the raw number as well as the percentages, because when you've got smaller states with a smaller number of students, 2 new students could be a whole lot of kids. So in Oklahoma, it was 78% year-over-year growth that also translated to about 45,000 kids. Now, when you look at the second highest number of kids, that was in Texas, which is about 29,000. Did I get that right, Drew? Yep. Okay, about 29,000 students. And so they were the number 2 spot in terms of the raw number of students enrolled, and you cannot attribute that to virtual charters. So there was certainly a handful of states where we'd say that was the case. And Drew, I'm going to ask you to jump in on this one too, but it was not so much so that we could really definitively attribute that tremendous amount of growth in the first full year of the pandemic, first full school year of the pandemic to virtuals.
I'm not sure that I have too much more to add. I'll just add on just a little bit more because I think Debbie did a really nice job of explaining it. So I feel like a little bit of a broken record, but there are some states where getting under the hood, so to speak, right, and getting a real clear sense of like school to school, what were the enrollment patterns, it's difficult. It's a limitation of the data, and there really isn't transparency around that that we've seen. But as Debbie mentioned, there are some places where we did see virtual enrollment contributing to the gains that charter saw, and I think the 3 states that you mentioned, Debbie, are good examples, and there are probably a couple more states even where that's the case. But it's also the case that there are places, and this is just like a smaller sector, but places like Mississippi, places like Washington, places like New York and Texas, where we saw a big enrollment growth, whether that be big for the sector if it's a small place, or big in terms of its magnitude because it's a big place already, where it wasn't just virtual enrollment. Thank
you, Drew. So I'm going to try to get to some people who didn't get to ask questions yet. So Tressa Pankovitz has a question here. Drew, specifically, she called you out to like to ask you about if there's a place where we were able to get school level data. We know it was not the case every place, but in places where we were able to get school level data, is there anything you can say about what we saw? And she was curious specifically about Fairfax County or Fairfax District, which is in Northern Virginia, for those who are not familiar with that. They had a really bad time trying to go to remote learning in the spring. And she's wondering if we saw anything there or any other places she could talk about.
The honest answer to that question is that we did not really examine that as a part of this report, just because there's such wide variation in what was available to us. Our focus was really on statewide trends. Virginia is an interesting example because I do believe for Virginia, we have school level information, so that might be something that we could look into. Virginia does have a small charter sector, but it's a charter sector that grew during the pandemic. So it would be interesting to look at Fairfax County to see what those trends look like.
Thank you. So we got a question from Carlos, who is saying that we got to address this elephant in the room. So yes, lots of growth, but also an all-out assault. That was also what was happening in that year. And is asking if we might speak to the best way to be able to move forward in light of this data. So we know that there's increased demand, but we also know that elected officials are coming for us, and some of our other opponents are coming for us. And so the question that he raises here is what can we do? And I know there's some people who are on this panel that have some very strong opinions about that. So Naomi, I'm gonna toss to you.
Well, I think, of course, the work that I've been doing over the last, I think now we're approaching 10 years, has been how do we amplify the voices of parents, which means I should see this question to be answered by a parent. I just want to quickly highlight that there are organizations that have been doing work related to education for years, and how do we make sure that they know that they have the support of the people to do this advocacy work, to share in this in adjusting and shifting the narrative around what parents and community members want, right? So the Freedom Coalition for Charter Schools is an organization that is doing direct advocacy related to charter schools led by people of color. My role in this work is not to do that direct advocacy, but to make sure that the work of leaders of color is amplified and shared and supported in ways that make sure that their voices are amplified and shared, so that we have the ability to advocate and make sure that elected officials and policymakers and decision makers and influentials know about these schools, know about their work, and know that parents are doing exactly what this report says, voting with their feet. We know during the election cycle last year that politicians, specifically Democrats, were saying that charters were problematic for communities of color. And we know that data just did not bear out, that overwhelmingly parents of color said, we support charter schools. So we should be able to have those parents be able to walk into their local or federal elected officials' offices and say, the work that you are doing to unravel our what has been supportive to us is problematic, and we don't want that. So I, of course, should have ceded this answer to the parent on the panel. Jasmine is amazing in the work that she does, and there are tons of parent advocacy organizations that are having to have had to stand up in the last 5 years because their voices have been so marginalized and minimized. Mm-hmm. So I will now shut up, but I wanted to make sure I brought up the organizations that are doing that exact work.
Naomi, I hope you don't mind. I just want to jump in here a little as well. And just to your point, I think that there's a formula here. We have infrastructure that is doing what they can do to build great schools, and to put the resources and the energy to develop our children. And now the piece that really needs to be elevated and organized, to your point, is the parents. In my organization, Unapologetic Parents, that's exactly what we're doing. We are organizing around the fact that this is what we want to preserve and protect: high quality education. And so not only is it just a mere fact of this concept of a charter school, but let's use this as the benchmark for what high quality education looks like. Like, why should any of our children have to have anything less? And so we are now we're organizing as a community of parents who are invested in this and who want this opportunity for our neighbors. because there's an old African proverb that, right, the child that is distanced from the fire, he will come back and burn it down. So it's no longer enough for my son to have a great education. I need all of his friends to have one too. And I need our lawmakers and our decision makers to be held accountable for that. And so in order for them to be held accountable for that, we as parents have to not only vote with our feet, but we have to vote. And we have to organize around what we're voting for. And we have to make our wants and needs known so that we give our leadership a chance to understand how important this is to us, and to react to it. So I want to continue to encourage all of the parent organizations, not just unapologetic parents, but all of the parent organizations, to continue to lend your voice to this effort. It means so much. It's going to change generations of families, because quite honestly, failing schools also have an impact on generations of families. So your work is so important because you're going to have that impact. And then to encourage your families and your community to vote so that we can have a long lasting impact, and that it kind of puts the rubber to the road.
Thank you so much, Jasmine. I would only layer on that and say we've got to get noisy. We got to get rude if it calls for that. We've got to make sure that our voices are being heard. And by ours, we really mean yours and other parents, Jasmine, because we are representing upwards of 3.5 million students right now. And those students have families. And I know that they love their children, and I know that they would raise their voices. And so the challenge for us as national advocacy organizations and people who do this kind of thing in our day jobs is we've got to create the space to let the thunderous voice of parents roar, so that people are very clear that this is not just something that's a nice to do. It's not just a policy thing. This is life. These are parents who want the best for their kids, and they can speak quite well for themselves when we give them the space to do that and just point them in the right direction. They can do it. These are parents that, as you said, found a way to get a birth certificate in a pandemic. These are parents that will take a bullet for their babies, and they will absolutely let legislators or anyone else who is blocking access for their kids, let them know how much they need this and want this. And I'll call upon us in the advocacy space to do a better job at coordinating with parents and letting them know, not just at the last minute when it's time to sign something or show up someplace, but working with them as true partners so that we can create this groundswell of support that is undeniable, so that when any elected official is thinking about messing with charter schools, they back up because they know that there are 3.5 million families that will come for them.
And I'm sorry, I just want to loop back to this, because I think that sometimes it's just so important from the parent perspective to just have that point of connection. Also, it's very emotional for a parent when we get this news of we may not have a school next year. It's almost like you're jolted. And so to your point, Debbie, I do the work unapologetic parents, because we no longer want to be apologetic about the process that's being made. We don't want schools to close down and then we have to fight for them to open back up. We want to stop that before that happens. We come from a long history of marches in the streets and violence for quality education, and then us as a country, we're apologetic about the abuse that was endured to get something that's rightfully deserved. So to your point, I'm advocating that we all rally behind parents so that we can do this unapologetically, so that we can go to lawmakers before they make these decisions, before we're so jolted by emotions and by hurt about what we deserve for our children, that we're marching in the streets and people are disrupted and really just upset and acting out. And that's a reality. We've seen that before, and not to be naive to think that would never happen again, because people are very, very emotional about the education of their children. So I just had to take this opportunity to, just encourage us not to just have action, but to let's be proactive in our action, and so that we can have unapologetic progress.
And to piggyback off that, the reason my organization exists is because a disproportionate number of closures of Black and Brown led schools because of the lack of support, right? Or because people are interested in making sure they dismantle the power that is born out of people having culturally affirming schools, right? So parents need those of us who have the ability to advocate with them need us to clear the way for their voices to be heard. So thank you so much, Jasmine, for all of those points.
Thank you to all of our panelists and to my co-author, Drew. You guys were awesome today. What an awesome discussion. And to everyone who joined with us, wonderful, lively discussion. We appreciate all of the engagement. Remember, voting with your feet. This is our new report that is out today. Please give us some love on the socials, and also make sure that you're giving some extra special love to Jasmine Morrison and Naomi Shelton, who are very close to this work as well. Thank you for joining us today. Have a great day.